started. Good afternoon. I'm Jane Vossler, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center. It's great to have Teresa Mayers here today. She's an associate professor of anthropology at UVM and has worked there, as she's just said, since 2011. She's got a PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington. And she's the author of Life on the Other Border, Farmworkers and Food Justice, and also numerous academic articles. So welcome, Teresa, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for joining. While there's a lot of downsides to pandemic life, the ability to do these talks remotely with my snoring dog next to me is definitely one of the benefits. And it's been a real pleasure to share this book with a lot of different audiences over the last several months as we've been mostly at home. So what I'll do is I'd like to share some of the main points, the main findings from my book, what it has told me about Vermont's dairy industry, what it has told me about immigration and border issues, and then I'll talk in some short detail about a really applied project that I helped coordinate with UVM Extension. So I'll pull up some slides and run through a few points, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. So, if you have anything, pipe up, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, and is that visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So as Jane mentioned, the title of this book is Life on the Other Border, Farmworkers and Food Justice in Vermont. And this is a project that I had sort of thought through a little bit before getting hired at UVM, builds upon some of what I looked at in my dissertation, but with a very different community and a very different sort of industry of workers. And so this project was many years in the making. The book came out, it was 7 months after my 2-year-old. And so it was a busy year of birthing various things. But really excited to share what I did in this book. And, hopefully we'll point you to a few other things that you might look at if you're interested in this topic. So I'd like to start out just with a cover because I think it's a telling cover. And as I was working with the marketing department at the University of California Press to think about what would this book look like, I gave them a few different options. Photographer Caleb Kenna, who is a well-known photographer in the area, gave me the permission to use this image from the Golden Cage exhibit, which is a project the Vermont Folklife Center did with Caleb Kenna and a number of different researchers about 10 years ago. Now it's close to 11 years ago. So this image, I think, is really telling. And I think when we, maybe when we have an image of farm workers in our mind, we think of men. We think of men maybe working in seasonal agriculture, which is, of course, a big part of what we see in the United States food system. But we also have the reality that we have mothers and families that are working to support our dairy economy here in the state. And this image of this young woman with her young child kind of suspended in this netting as she is working in a milking barn is an important dimension of the reality that we do have in the dairy industry. I think that one of the reasons that the press was drawn to this image and one of the reasons that I connect with this image is that I think it reminds us that farm workers in whatever industry are more than just the work that they contribute, that they are family members, that they are mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And as an anthropologist, I think it's really important to think about that sort of complexity and that holistic sort of sense of who they are. So that's the cover of the book. It came out in April of 2019. Was really excited to see it come out. It was my first book. I thought for a while it was going to be my last book, but hopefully we'll be actually starting a couple of new projects in future years, which I'm happy to talk about too. So I want to provide just kind of an overview of what we know about the role of farm workers in the U.S. dairy industry before I focus a bit more on Vermont. And the dairy industry, for those of you who are from Vermont or know Vermont well, you probably have a good sense that this is an industry that has had a lot of challenges in recent years. We've seen with COVID, very low prices for milk that dairy farm owners are receiving. We know about the volatility in this industry. But what is perhaps less understood is how dependent the dairy industry nationally has become on farm workers from outside of the country. So the National Milk Producers Federation estimates that about half of all workers on U.S. dairy farms are immigrants, and the vast majority of those are from Mexico. And if we look at the economic impact, again, I don't want to say that's the only contribution or impact, but if we were to lose these workers, we would see a doubling of our retail milk prices nationally, and the U.S. economy would be hit by about a $32 billion cut. And so what's happening in Vermont with a growing dependence upon workers from Latin America is something that we see in a lot of other key dairy states like Wisconsin and New York and California and Colorado. But as I'll point to, our economy here is quite a bit different in some ways than some of these other places where dairy farms are really, really big. It's often said that our largest farms in Vermont are Wisconsin's smallest farms, and there's some truth to that. But what is common between Vermont and some of these other states is this dependence on farm workers, again, mostly from Mexico. So this is an important reality to keep in mind, when we're looking at conversations around immigration reform, when we think about, what our economy would look like if we didn't have workers, again, from Mexico and other regions of Latin America. So that's just an important way I want to introduce this story. If we look at Vermont, the numbers are smaller, though. The numbers range quite a bit. You might have seen numbers as high as 2,000 to 2,500. But based on UVM extension data, which is the data that I tend to utilize in my own research, is we know there's probably about 1,000 to 1,200 farm workers from Latin America in Vermont. Most of these are men, mostly men coming from southern Mexico, but also some countries in Central America and regions of central Mexico. And the vast majority of these workers are undocumented. So something to know, and this is an important thing to realize when we talk about immigration reform or when we talk about visa programs, is that currently there's no real legal pathway into becoming a farm worker in the dairy industry if you're not born in the United States. We do have a seasonal work program called the H2a Visa program, which, for example, brings workers from Jamaica into Vermont to pick apples in the fall. But that visa program, the H2a program, is a seasonal program. And dairy work is not seasonal work, it's year-round work. Part of that is artificial. The ways that we keep milk being produced is not entirely a natural process. But there is sort of the reality that most of the workers in this industry are undocumented. I was presenting next to a dairy farm owner from the Upper Valley, and he leaned over. He's like, Teresa, it's closer to 99%. And so when we think about all of the challenges that individuals within this community might have, questions of citizenship and not being documented are very important. And that's part of the story that I tell in this book. Again, it's mostly men, men as young, sometimes as 14, as old as 64, but usually clustering in the 20s and early 30s. And there are some women who are milking cows on these farms, but most of the women who are in Vermont are here to join with their husbands or their male partners. And so there's a certain gendered dimension to this that I'll also talk about. But again, it's a relatively small number. But again, looking at Vermont as a total population, we're also a fairly small state. So one of the things that I describe in this book is drawing upon some previous work that was done in California agriculture by a geographer, Don Mitchell. He taught at Syracuse University until pretty recently. And what he describes about California is that there's what he calls a normalized geography of farm worker invisibility, meaning that when we look at our landscapes, when we think about our farming systems, farm workers and their contributions are really often unseen. this image taken by my research assistant, Jessie, of some cows in sort of an early morning Vermont rural landscape, is often what we think about. The imagery of cows, of red barns, of rolling green hills is much more visible often than Mexican farm workers who are sustaining this industry. And so throughout this book, what I consider is what are some of the forces that are responsible for that are keeping farm workers invisible and at the same time making them very visible when they're in public. And if you are, from the state, and if you have been looking at recent, not even recent, but over the last several years, that we have seen a number of farm workers detained when they have been in public. And so something that I think about through this book a lot is what is unique about Vermont in terms of our state's history, our racial demographics, the rural nature of the state that leaves farm workers in this kind of conundrum of being invisible in the worksite, but very visible in public. My colleague, Susanna McCandless, a geographer, has described Vermont as a carceral landscape for farm workers, meaning that the farms and the sort of rural landscape functions as a prison for farm workers. And that's something that I think through quite a bit in this book are what are the forces that are keeping people really close to home, and what are the impacts on that for their health, for access to food, for access to healthcare, all of those kinds of questions that are really important to consider. So I'll talk a little bit about the specific research methods that I've used. As an anthropologist, I've been described as a professional storyteller, which I actually really like that description. But a lot of what I've done for this project is to interview farm workers about their lives back home in Mexico, about their lives here in Vermont. And because my primary focus is on food access, about the ways that they are getting food or prevented from getting food in the ways that they would like. And there's one term that has appeared more commonly than any other term, which is this term of Enserado. People describe their lives as being Enserado, which translated means a few different things in English. Being confined, being trapped, being bounded, and being enclosed. And this term has really repeatedly appeared throughout these interviews, and it's something that I deal with a lot in this book, of what are the consequences of feeling confined? What are the consequences of feeling like you can't leave your home? And there are some very real consequences when we look at accessing basic needs, including food. So through this book, what I talk a lot about are various iterations of the border. I entered into this project, knowing that I was doing research close to an international border, but not really fully understanding just how important that was for people's daily lives. And so the title of the book, Life on the Other Border, is meant to sort of indicate that a lot of our national attention, for a very good reason, is focused on the US-Mexico border. And we've seen, over the last 4 years, how politicized and hostile we sometimes talk about that border. But through this book, what I describe is how the US-Canada border is also a really important place to understand when we are looking at, again, workers from Latin America. So the border plays a really prominent role in this book. And the title, The Other Border, came to me as I was actually driving around rural Vermont with the former director of Food First, Eric Holt Jimenez, who a really important person in terms of food scholarship and food justice and food sovereignty work. And he's like, this is kind of the other border up here. And I was like, that is exactly what I'm seeing. So these two maps appear in the book, and I think it's important for us to think about just where are we in relationship to these spaces, and where are farm workers in relationship to these spaces. So the map on the left is reproduced from a book that I contributed to called Food Across Borders, and it shows the 100-mile zone on all sides of the United States that Border Patrol has jurisdiction over, on coastal areas, on land borders. Border Patrol has certain abilities to ask about citizenship, to ask about our activities, to stop us and to detain us, and to detain farm workers. And so if we look at how far that goes into Vermont, it includes something like 90 to 93% of the state's residents. So many of us, whether we are actively thinking about it or not, are living in a borderland. And I know for many of us who might have relationships, family relationships north of the border, the sort of the Quebecois influence in Vermont is very strong. And we've seen how that border has really changed, especially since COVID started, but even, since 9/11, how that border has become much more reinforced. So the 25-mile zone is known as the primary operating domain where Border Patrol is very active. And if you're in Franklin County, the Northeast Kingdom, parts of Grand Isle County, you know that it's very likely that you will see Border Patrol as you are out in rural areas. And that's definitely something that causes a lot of concern for farm workers who are in the dairy industry. The map on the right translates those borders, the 100-mile and the 25-mile zone, through Rutland and Windsor County in the south and through Chittenden, Lamoille, Caledonia, and Essex County in the north. And this map is a really interesting one produced by my colleagues at UVM Extension, Bridges to Health, where we can see pretty much where farm workers are in our state. And those are in two of the key dairy producing counties, Franklin and Addison County. On this map, if it's a little small for you, one dot indicates one farm worker. So we know the vast majority of farm workers in our state are in that 100-mile zone, and a lot of them are in that 25-mile zone. And so there is this kind of question about, if we know where farm workers are living and working, why don't we see the same kinds of raids that we might see in other parts of the United States, that we've seen on meatpacking plants and canneries and things like that. And that's a big story we can talk about. There's been some really interesting political discourse around that since I moved here. But I think one thing to note is that this map would look very different in California. This map would look very different in Florida. And the fact that we have such a clear understanding of, again, where this small community is living and working is part of the uniqueness of Vermont. But it also reminds us of that sort of border reality. So as many of you know, Vermont's dairy industry has really, really dramatically changed in the last 80 years. In 1940s, we had roughly 11,000 dairies, a lot of small family farms. In 2012, that had dropped to 1,000. And as of right now, I think we're somewhere in like 600 in the 60s as of late 2020. And so the dairy economy has changed really dramatically. And this kind of consolidation where we have fewer people in control, fewer companies in control, and where the production of milk has really just sort of increased dramatically is something that we see in lots of other sectors of the food economy. Retail chains, grocery chains are incredibly consolidated. Fast food companies, larger restaurant chains are increasingly really consolidated. When we have concerns about food safety, it's a lot to do with the fact that our industry is so consolidated, and sometimes we don't know exactly where our food is coming from. And so this has been a really important factor in changing sort of how dairy is produced in the state. What's important to note, though, is with these fewer number of dairies, we are producing more milk than we did in the 1940s. And so cow herds are getting much larger, milking herds are getting much larger. Cows are often being milked sometimes 3 times a day. They are kept pregnant much more frequently and then lactating much more frequently. And so the industry has just really kind of sped up in a number of ways. There's also ways that our own consumer demands play into that, right? Greek yogurt, for example, which has gotten very trendy in the last several years, requires a lot more fluid milk to produce. Whey protein that we put in smoothies is sometimes a more profitable byproduct than the actual milk that it's produced from. And so these changes are just an important set of conditions that we want to also acknowledge. It's also the reality that dairy work is very hard. It's a very volatile industry. COVID has shown how dairy farm owners are getting terrible prices for their milk, often below the cost of production. And so this industry has just become, in some ways, a really unpredictable and a very different industry than it was, during my mom's childhood. The other thing to note is that, again, this is what we see in Wisconsin, California, Colorado, all these dairy producing states, where the small family farm has a really hard time getting by. Since the late 1990s, what we've seen is that the fact that dairy farms are getting bigger and milking larger herds is going hand in hand with increased dependence on workers from Mexico, often working, 70-hour weeks, often for salaries lower than would be paid to US-born workers. So if we look at how dependent our state is, we are the most dependent state on one agricultural commodity. That commodity is milk. 68% of Vermont's milk comes from dairies with migrant workers employed, $320 million. And that's about 43% of New England's milk supply. And so again, our state is incredibly dependent upon this really, volatile industry. And this industry is really dependent upon workers from outside the country. Prior to me doing this food security work, there was limited research done with the farm worker community, but a lot of it did focus on health. My colleague Dan Baker in the Community Development and Applied Economics Department has done a number of projects looking at the health impacts of living and working here. We know that workers experience depression, isolation, anxiety, physical pain, and barriers in accessing care. One of the things that I think has been really, has made me think a lot over the last 10 months is how this experience that many of us are having in the pandemic of being isolated, of having anxiety, of having, really widespread depression, is giving us a small sense of what farm workers experience on a daily basis for years on end. And I think that that's an important kind of reminder that maybe right now we actually have a good possibility for empathy and for greater understanding of this community. So I'm a food anthropologist, and I love what I do. I love studying food. I think it's a really powerful way of understanding culture. And I study food security, how likely people are to have food in their households. And when we think about food security, we often think about statistics and numbers. Hunger Free Vermont, for example, produces some really great data and statistics and shares that data about how hungry Vermont is. Colleagues of mine at UVM are doing that as well. But as an anthropologist, as that professional storyteller that I like to tell myself I am, this image on the left is actually, to me, as much information about food security as I might get from a survey. So this image was taken inside a farm worker home in Addison County. The green items on the floor are tomatillos, which if you're a gardener, they can grow pretty well in Vermont. Member of the gooseberry family. And this farm worker who lived in this home had a garden where he grew a lot of tomatillos. He knew that they keep really well. They don't need to be processed necessarily. They don't need to be frozen necessarily, as long as they're kept in their husks. And when I look at this image, I actually see this as a really compelling example of food security. He knows that for probably the next several months, he can make a salsa verde with this item. He can have predictable access to a food that has tremendous cultural importance for him. But this kind of food security, this understanding of food security, isn't necessarily captured in the main tools that we use to study it. And so I want to talk a little bit about the tools that I've used and where I see some of those tools doing a really bad job, actually. What we know nationally is that farm workers, especially in the places that have been studied, seasonal workers, and in places with long histories of migration, farm workers from Latin America sometimes experience food insecurity at 3 to 4 times the national average. And if we think about that, the fact that people who are producing food for us are going hungry, that is a big, violent contradiction in our food system. We can think about that number also being represented by restaurant workers, which is the pandemic has certainly shown, by school lunch professionals, that we see often higher rates of hunger and food insecurity in people who are bringing us our food. There was really no data. There were no data about farm workers and their experiences in Vermont prior to me doing this research. And so that's what I set out to do, is to get that data so we might make some of those comparisons. And as I'll talk about, a lot of the work that I've done has been really made possible by my involvement with an applied project called Huertas, which is a UVM extension project where we work with farm workers to build and maintain kitchen gardens so that access to fresh, culturally familiar foods might be improved. So I'll talk briefly about the survey. So the survey that I utilized is the same survey that is used nationally. Every year, the USDA puts out something called the Household Food Security Report, United States 2019, I think is the 2019 is the most recent one now. All of these data are collected through the same survey. It's a 16-question survey. It's really quick to administer. You can survey thousands of people very quickly. And it's the same data that is used to think about, the rates of hunger and the rates of food insecurity everywhere. Although hunger is a slightly more complicated subject, which I'm happy to talk about. The USDA has changed some of their measurements recently. So I used the same survey because I thought, well, if this same survey has been used in other farm worker studies and has been used in our studies of Vermont, it will give me a sense of how Vermont farm workers compare. I oversampled women because women tend to have a large role in the kind of food that is being brought into the home. And what these data show, what these surveys showed, I surveyed 100 individuals, is that only about 18% of these farm worker households were classified as food insecure, which was kind of surprising because that is higher, but not that much higher than the Vermont average or the US average. And it's nowhere near the same numbers that we saw in other farm worker food security studies. However, what I will show and what I've talked about in the book is that these numbers are really flawed. And part of the reason for that is that this survey is really poorly designed for farm workers who are often experiencing or who often are supporting families on both sides of the border, and for people who not having money or having money is not the only connection to whether they have food or not. So the survey, which is 16 questions, has additional questions at the end for families with children, primarily asks individuals to indicate whether they have enough money for a healthy, varied diet, whether they have enough money, whether they've had to skip a meal because they didn't have enough money for food. It's entirely based around one pillar of food security, which is money. It doesn't ask people whether they are afraid to go to the grocery store. It doesn't ask people whether they are sending the majority of their money back home to their wife and children so they eat less here. It doesn't get any of that more complicated information that me as an anthropologist, I really want that kind of information. And so I paired those surveys with some in-depth interviews that I'll talk a little bit more about. But what's interesting is when we put those data on that map that I showed before, the higher rates of 18% are in the border areas in Franklin and Grand Isle County. The slightly more Vermont average-like rates are in Addison County. My colleague Naomi, who works with UVM Extension's Bridges to Health, did a study on people requesting medicines sent from home. Similar kind of thing. More people were requesting that in the border region than they were even further south. In a lot of the interviews that I did, when I was interviewing farm workers from Addison County, for example, they would describe, well, I used to work up in Franklin County, but it was just so hard. I wanted to get further away from the border. So even, maybe an hour and a half spent in a car can have a really tremendous impact on how comfortable people feel in getting outside their home. So I want to talk just kind of briefly about the overall observations that I have in this book. And the first is that why farm workers are food insecure is very, very different than other parts of the country and with different communities of farm workers. Vermont is a very rural place. And the fact that undocumented workers are living and working very close to an international border means that they're often very hesitant about going outside the home to get food or healthcare or go to church or take their children to school because of a fear of Border Patrol. So that border proximity, coupled with the fact that Vermont is a very white state, we are the second least ethnically diverse state in the country, although we go back and forth about that dubious honor with Maine. And so if you are an individual from central or southern Mexico, maybe coming from an indigenous background, maybe Spanish is your second language, those individuals are often very visible in rural areas of Vermont. And over the last few years, we've seen a number of farm workers detained when they're in public, doing, nothing wrong, right? Doing nothing sort of illegal. And we can talk about the questions of legality and illegality if you like, but just because they're in public and they're visible. So people are often very immobile. We do have a recent policy shift, not so recent now, but more recent, where anyone in Vermont can get a driver's permission card without citizenship status. That was an important policy achievement by an organization, Migrant Justice. But that doesn't change the fact that we have a federal border. So even if you have a Vermont driver's permission card, Border Patrol can still pick you up. There's a lot of dependency on third parties to access food. What I've seen in my interviews is that very few people are doing their own grocery shopping. My colleague Naomi did a kind of an informal brief survey. I think it's something like 95% of people weren't getting their own groceries. And so I've, seen this since I had a child. My husband is doing a lot more of the shopping, especially, we don't go shopping together anymore. And the things that he brings home are very different than the things that I would prefer he brings home. And so if you're getting your groceries entirely from a third party, you might think, okay, well, I'm not necessarily getting the things that I want, especially, maybe only getting groceries every 15 days. There's also the reality that Vermont is not exactly what I call the Mecca of Mexican food. I've lived in, a few parts of the country, even Colorado, where I grew up, and parts of Seattle. The availability of Mexican ingredients, of Mexican products is much more available than we see in Vermont. When I first moved here, I was really struck by how hard it was to get certain ingredients that I was really kind of taking for granted in other places. So even though, City Market and Hunger Mountain stock a lot of dried chilies and dried herbs that might be accessible or might be familiar, those aren't necessarily accessible to farm workers who are not going into those grocery stores themselves. The second main finding that I have is that how we measure and understand food insecurity is really flawed. The first thing is that the USDA module is designed as a household survey, so it asks about members of your household. When I gave this survey, invariably people would say, okay, are you talking about my family back home in Mexico that I'm supporting, my kids and my wife back home? Or are you talking about the 4 young men that I live with here, right? So how we even define a household is not, the survey is not suited for. As I mentioned, it's not just about a lack of money. For farm workers who might work 70 hours a week, getting time to go to the grocery store can be difficult. Getting to the grocery store might be difficult. Feeling unafraid of being in public is often an issue. And so that lack of money is complicated by all of those other levels of inaccessibility to food. And I think for me, what I think is more important perhaps than anything is that when we understand or when we study food insecurity or hunger or poverty, we often only look at the absence, the lack, the problems. We don't look at how people thrive or remain resilient and creative in the midst of that. And in my interviews, what I was equally interested in is, okay, well, given these challenges, what do you do, to provide your kids with food? What do you do to ensure that you are able to eat meals that have a lot of meaning for you? So the project that I've been involved with that I'll kind of close with talking about is a project called Huertas, which translates as kitchen garden in Spanish. It's a project of UVM Extension that started kind of informally in 2009 and became a bit more formal in 2011 when I got here. We host interns from UVM, and students get credit, sometimes even get paid for working with us. And our primary purpose is to increase access to fresh produce, especially culturally familiar crops and vegetables in the summer months with farm workers in the border regions. We primarily work in Franklin County in the Northeast Kingdom and parts of Grand Isle. This project, we've worked on as many as 40 dairies. That was way too many for a barely funded organization. So typically on an annual basis, we work on anywhere from 20 to 25 dairies, which translates to usually around 100 individuals each year. So I'm going to get into this discussion just with a brief kind of interlude. A few years ago, I got involved unexpectedly with a collaborative project with the Vermont Folk Life Center, the Open Door Clinic, and some cartoonist colleagues, where we've worked with farm workers and artists to produce some mini graphic novels around farm workers' experiences in Vermont based on interviews that we've done. And then the artists take those interviews and turn them into mini graphic novels, focusing on depression, focusing on the coping with depression, focusing on all kinds of different topics. If you're interested, the Folk Life Center hosts all of these bilingually. You can see all of them online right now. We're actually turning them into a book right now too, which is exciting. But this narrative shared by Juana describes how, at home she could shop. In Mexico, she could go out on a daily basis. Even if she was poor, she could go to the store and find what she might be able to afford. Whereas here in Vermont, she can't just go to the store. She has to plan for 15 days. And if they run out of ingredients, she just has to do what she can. She ends with, here we can buy the food that we want. The problem is that we cannot leave. And again, that idea of being encerado, of being enclosed, is really powerful in this narrative because it describes just exactly what is preventing her from having the food that she would really like to have. And the garden in some way has fulfilled some of that for individuals like her. So I just want to share a few images of these gardens. These images are all shared with people's permission to talk about our project. I also take care to only show images of people who have returned home to Mexico. So Tomas was and again, pseudonyms in all of these. Tomas is a individual who worked in the United States for 40 years, anywhere from picking beets he was picking lettuce and beets and tomato and I think oranges and tobacco. He had lived and worked in Vermont for about, I think, a total of 10 to 11 years. And this garden that we worked with him to plant, he was planting in some ways before we got involved, but accessing certain seeds and plants was really what he needed from us. He did not need us to tell him how to grow food, though. He was a farmer, and he had been working in the United States for so long to save up money and to purchase land in Mexico so that he might farm, and that's what he returned home to do. But what we see in his garden is just this tremendous example of, things like companion planting, planting things for pollinators, doing all these sort of so-called permaculture techniques, which are actually rooted in indigenous sort of ancestral knowledge. So he didn't need us to teach him anything. He needed us to help him get some seeds, and he could do the rest. And what we saw in his garden is just this tremendous ability to identify the foods that were meaningful for him, to grow them, and then to share them. He was known to share food with anyone who would sort of cross within 10 feet of him, including myself and our interns and healthcare volunteers. Invariably, people would leave his home with their trunks full of produce. I often tell a story. He told me that he had kids in Maine, and he would box up butternut squash and mail them to his kids in Spain. Maine. Spain would be much more expensive. In Maine, as a way of sharing this. And I think of all the things to mail, butternut squash is probably one of the heavier things to mail. Tomas was actually from the same place as Lourdes, from a small village in Mexico. What I've seen through involvement of women in this project is that it's often a really powerful way of people, especially mothers, sharing culturally familiar foods with their kids. Sharing dishes that they might not be able to if they weren't growing some of these items. So she was a wonderful chef, is a wonderful chef. And she would often cook chile rellenos for her families with these peppers that she would grow. That child became this child over a few years. And these gardens often become a place, for kids to experience a number of things, not just food, but about access to natural space, places where they can spend their time with their families that are, meaningful. And what we've seen is that the gardens often become, the food becomes the byproduct, and that more fundamental, more meaningful things are actually cultivated in these spaces, which I think for those of us who garden, you might understand how that works out in your own life. Again, these gardens become places for kids to celebrate, for kids to explore. Again, a reminder that farm workers, have families, and we have mothers in this community that are working on dairies. And so this project, again, which is a pretty, I would say, kind of it's a bit of a grassroots project, we can call it that. Not a whole lot of funding, not a whole lot of time for any of us, accomplishes quite a bit with limited resources. We've also seen that through this project that food is important. The food security piece is certainly key, but beautifying one's environment to make, their time in Vermont a bit more pleasant is also really an important piece. This is the first garden that a woman named Juana grew. She actually didn't know a lot about growing food, even though her family grew coffee where she was from. But she knew how to grow flowers. And over time, what she realized is that she could sort of have her flower area in the garden, but also grow a lot of food. And so, I'm a gardener. I feel like I'm a constantly failing gardener. But this project really has shown just how important this connection can be for people who are very far away from their families and their homes. And this is something that we see in I would say, the vast majority of immigrant communities, whether we're talking about New American groups here in Burlington or the Burlington area, or farm workers from Mexico in rural areas. So I'll just end with this final piece, and this is something that I can talk a bit about, is that what I've described in this talk about the book is a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenge, a lot of structural violence and structural racism in the food system. But what we've also seen since I got here in Vermont and started doing this project is a really important shift where farm workers have become organized, and the Milk with Dignity program, which was signed between Migrant Justice and Ben & Jerry's a few years ago now, to me is a really compelling example of where we might think differently about dairy and about those who work within the industry. Full disclosure, I'm on their board, so I have certain appreciation of the work, but nationally and internationally, it's a really interesting and important model of how we might improve farm worker conditions on these dairies through really taking lessons from farm worker leadership. So I'm going to leave us with that because I think it indicates that we are in a moment of optimism. I feel like over the last week and a half, I've been a lot more optimistic about things regarding immigration and border policy than I was for about 4 years. But we certainly, have both really pressing challenges confronting this community and also some really exciting possibilities. So I'm going to wrap up there and stop sharing my screen. We have some time for discussion and questions. I think you can either unmute yourself and just chat over voice. I think you can raise your hand. I'm not sure. There must be a chat feature too. If you want to put anything in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah. Teresa?
Yeah.
What was the Spanish word for the program that you have? The gardening program?
It's called Huertas. So Huertas, or Huerto Familiar, is a name for basically a small diversified family that is a small diversified family garden, basically.
Well, that's a name for the garden.
Yeah. So we took that term in Spanish and used it as our program name. And it's interesting because some of the farm workers were like, oh yeah, that's a term that's recognizable. But for a number of farm workers, they actually come from regions where growing lots of corn is much more of a common practice. And so milpa agriculture is more familiar than the sort of smaller scale gardening. So we have different levels of familiarity with this kind of small diversified garden that we're working with. Yeah, Christine.
Teresa, you may not be able to answer this question, but I attended a migrant justice rally outside of this supermarket. What's the name of it? And what I had difficulty what I had an emotional reaction to and had difficulty understanding were the extreme expressions of anger that I experienced from the people, not in the rally, but just shopping when I tried to hand out literature.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you see as the reasons for that extreme expression of anger.
Yeah.
Is it more than racism, or what is it?
I think it's really complicated. I think that I think it's a combination of sort of racist prejudice. Absolutely. I also think to me as an anthropologist, I'm kind of optimistic in the sense that like if we could really understand each other as humans, if we could really understand the challenges that we collectively face, maybe we wouldn't be so hostile towards one another, but maybe I'm slightly delusional there, but I feel like it's misunderstanding. I feel like it is, I think it's the result also of several years of legitimizing anti-immigrant sentiment. When you have your highest elected representative making the kinds of outlandish claims and using some really hurtful language about a community, I think that then, makes it seem like that's okay. Farmworkers would describe how the last 4 years were much different than the previous years in the kinds of interactions that they might have with the general public. So I think it's a lot of those things. I think it's also perhaps part of, a concern, you hear this job of people taking our jobs, that why are those jobs going to Vermonters? And so I think that there are sometimes some economic kind of dimensions to that, but I don't think it's one easy answer. But I think it's a combination of bigotry, of class dynamics, of lack of understanding. And to me, I feel like if people could let their guard down long enough and really understand, what are the root causes of migration? And to me, food insecurity at home is one of the root causes of migration. Maybe they could have a bit more of common ground being built, but I think it's a really important question because, while I am cautiously optimistic about where we are right now around immigration and border issues, there's a lot of deep stuff right now. And hopefully that will shift for the better.
And my second question is, how are they able to come across the Canadian to Vermont border?
They're not crossing the Canadian-Vermont border. They're crossing typically from Mexico into the United States and then living and working near the border. But at this point, there's no evidence that people are crossing down from Canada, at least that I know of. Yeah. And
okay, you just explained more intensely patrolled, but they're coming up from the south. They're crossing that border there.
Yeah, exactly. And there's been some shift, I think, earlier on. A lot of the individuals who were working in Vermont, in the 90s and the early 2000s, were working in other parts of the country. I would have older farm workers describe how, again, they had picked tobacco, they had picked oranges, they had harvested lettuce, maybe working in construction. And then they found out about the potential of working year round, which having a year-round job is a much more promising option than working seasonally. So early on, I think we saw mostly people moving from other parts of the United States who were already here working. But once those family connections are built, and someone has an uncle up here or a cousin up here, then it's more likely people will come directly from Mexico to Vermont. Very long process, a process that I don't spend a lot of time researching, but there's another really good book called Milking in the Shadows. And it's written by a colleague of mine, Julie Keller, about the Wisconsin dairy industry. And she does a lot more work around the sort of actual migration process and how dairy farm owners facilitate that process as well. But that's slightly outside of my area. But everyone that I've talked to, they did not cross the U.S.-Canada border.
So are farmers penalized for hiring undocumented workers? And how many Vermonters would take those jobs anyway?
Those are good questions. So very few, if any. I don't know of any, but that's again slightly outside of my research scope. That farm owners typically are not penalized. They could be if they were knowingly employing people. But there are documents that are used, often falsified. And so farm owners can say, oh, it's not my job to patrol that or to follow up on that. That's often what happens. And, whether Vermonters would do these jobs or not, I think that, that's a big question, because if we look at the dairy economy, oftentimes, those small family farms were based upon child labor and the labor of the unpaid wives, and so that has shifted obviously in some important ways. But having not done interviews with farm workers or farm owners, I've listened to a lot of them that have been done, and farm owners will regularly describe, I can't find workers. I can't find people to do this work. I've tried to hire people from Vermont. They stay for a day and they leave. I think we also have to think about what are the wages that are being paid. Could this work be more attractive to people that are Vermont? Maybe. But by and large, if you look at how farm owners describe why they employ these workers, it's because they can't find this source of labor. The Golden Cage exhibit, which is up on the Folk Life Center website, has some really good interviews with farm owners. They're about 10, 11 years old now, but they talk about that inability to find workers from the state. And there's also, I think, there is that question of like, what is the salary that's being paid, or what is the pay that's going, what is acceptable, what is not? So, those are bigger questions too.
Teresa, do you have any statistics on how many children that are in these households go to school?
So no statistics, because for anything to be statistically significant, we need a larger number. There's not a whole lot of kids. But I can say that all of the children that I know that are school age are going to school. They are going to public school. Sometimes they're the only Spanish-speaking kid in their school. But all of the kids that I know that are school age are in public schools. And there is a program called Migrant Ed, which works with older children, up to, I think it's either age 22 or 24, where they work often with people to get a GED and to, on that side of public schooling. But yeah, all of the kids that I know personally or through my research are attending public school.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What
Awesome.
about the churches? Churches, are they where can they get together with each other at church?
Some churches have been accessible. Yeah, there are a couple of churches, and there's even a church that was holding Spanish service for a while, closer to where I am in Charlotte, Virgin's area. So church is definitely something that people would like to do more. What is interesting is that of the few people who are visiting Vermont dairy farms to interact with farm workers, actually traveling proselytizers have been pretty active. And so members of certain churches are going on farms and leading mini Bible lessons and working with people in their faith. I think that people would like to have more access to church as well, for sure. Joanna has a question in the chat about the Open Door Clinic. Yeah, this is a program that I've worked a little bit with, doing actually a project on oral health and dental care right now with the Open Door Clinic. But the Open Door Clinic is based in Middlebury. They also have clinics in Virgins, and they work with a wide variety of community members, uninsured, underinsured. They serve the farm worker community, both H2a Visa recipients as well as farm workers from Latin America. It's a really important clinic that provides largely routine care and references out to, specialists when needed. But they have a couple of clinics and a number of staff members who are bilingual, and they have worked really hard to improve their offerings to Spanish-speaking members of the Vermont community, both oral health, mental health, routine physical health, a really important place. And what's really fortunate for my research is that when I was looking around for places to do surveys and to talk to people about food access, I talked with Julia Doucette, who's the main nurse at the Open Door Clinic coordinating care for farm workers. And she's like, yeah, just sit in my waiting room and talk to people as they're waiting. And it turns out people are really bored and they're happy to talk in waiting rooms. And so I did a number of my surveys in their waiting room. And then that's actually how that comics project started, is that I started doing some interviews for that project in the clinic. But a really, really great program. Works a lot with Bridges to Health. And in terms of the response to COVID and COVID incidents on farms, they've been very active working on that. Wages vary. I think that Migrant Justice has some of the best data about wages. That they have a pretty thorough report from some surveys that they've done. Wages, compared to seasonal work are better, but they could be better. There's also some difficulty in pinpointing exact wages because oftentimes people are also provided housing. And so how that factors into wages is also, complicated. But the Migrant Justice website and their recent survey, not like super, super recent, but their most recent survey has some good data about the wages there. Healthcare, not necessarily, no. And that's one of the main purposes of the Open Door Clinic is that it's exceptionally difficult to get health insurance as an undocumented person. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And so healthcare is typically not provided. Sometimes rides to the clinic, things like that, but people are often paying out of pocket or delaying care. There's sort of in the literature around immigrant health, what we know is that in general, people often don't go to the doctor until it's an emergency. And people often show most of their health impacts after returning home to Mexico. Not most, but a lot of the impacts. And so those aren't even captured within sort of US health data, is that we don't see the impacts of working 70 hours a week and eating poorly until many years later when they're home. And being documented, becoming documented, that right now, and under the previous administration, there's no real way. That again, because of the way that the H2a Visa program is built, which I don't think is the answer. Personally, I don't think expanding the H2a program to include dairy workers is the answer because the program has a lot of flaws. But we'll see. That's kind of a to be determined whether we will see a path to citizenship for workers, essential workers or not. That is to be seen, but very little possibility for that in the previous many years, not just the 4 years, but previous many years. And the Milk with Dignity program, I also take a peek online because there's some great information both from both with Migrant Justice as well as the Milk with Dignity Standards Council. But essentially, Milk with Dignity is an extension of the first extension of the Fair Food Program, which was developed by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida with large-scale purchasers like Taco Bell, large retail operations and grocery stores, where these buyers, large corporate buyers, would pledge to spend 1 more penny per pound on the tomatoes, and that money would go to improving conditions for farm workers. So how that translates in Vermont, Milk with Dignity right now has been signed successfully with Ben & Jerry's. And so farms in Vermont that are providing Ben & Jerry's milk for their ice cream follow a set of standards that was developed by farm workers and agreed to by Ben & Jerry's company. And so it has certain things about, education and health and safety issues, But essentially, farmers participating in this program get paid a premium for their product that they then can use to improve conditions on their farms. The new campaign, again, really refer you to the Migrant Justice website, is looking at improving the conditions of farms that provide Hannaford with their milk. So instead of a large-scale producer going to a large-scale retail operation. And we'll see where that goes. The campaign is definitely in the midst of it. But to me, it's a really exciting program because so often, our understanding of what makes better work or what improves conditions for workers comes from like boardrooms. It doesn't come from workers themselves who know the most about what they really need. And both the Fair Food Program and Milk with Dignity are developed from farm worker knowledge and priorities. And I think that that's really exciting. So, a relatively new program, but has gotten a lot of national attention. And, I was really excited to be there at the day of celebration where it was signed. And, watching CEO Ben & Jerry's sign a contract with farm workers from Mexico was really, really exciting for me.
Teresa, I don't know if you have time. Oh, sorry. But hey, how are you?
A student of mine.
I was just wondering, I get here in Richmond, the fair and impartial policing policy just went through, and I'm wondering how that policy has any change on, the folks that you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, the fair and impartial, so that is another, the fair and impartial policing campaign, known within migrant justice as Nomos Polimigra, has been unrolled and rolled out at the county level largely, or sort of city level too in some cases. And what this policy really states is that local law enforcement will not act as immigration enforcement, and that bias in policing, through education and through, all kinds of things will be hopefully reduced, if not eliminated. And I think that that's a really important piece that will improve and can improve farm workers' experiences because, for example, if people are afraid, as I've learned in my research, about going to regular healthcare visits because the office was across the street from the local police, that has impacts on people's health and well-being. So I think the fair and impartial policing work is really important. I'm excited that it recently has been approved in a number of new places. And I think that that's, an important thing to consider is like, what role does local law enforcement have to do with immigration issues? They are two different entities, and they in my mind, should remain two different entities. So there's also the reality that, for example, if women are fearful about calling the police because of domestic violence or whatever it happens to be, because they might be deported or detained and deported, that has real consequences. And so where we can, very clearly have lines between local and federal sort of police, those lines to me are very important to be very clear. Great question, Kyle. It's almost like you were back in my class.
Oh, one of your students. Wow.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Christine?
Is there an educational component to the disconnect between an agency like ICE and the understanding that this group of people improves the food security of Vermont, which is obvious to us listening to you, but not obvious to those institutions?
Yeah, I think that in educational, as an educator, I have firm belief that education can change things. I also think that, the ways that border policy has shifted post 9/11 is a really important factor, and that, in talking with some colleagues who have lived in Vermont for a long time, they describe, Border Patrol, and ICE is different than Border Patrol, but Border Patrol, they used to just be members of the community, and they understood the dynamics, and they understood, they were members of the community. And my understanding is that post 9/11, a lot of Border Patrol agents and ICE agents are not from the local community. They've often been trained at the US-Mexico border. And then, that sort of lack of understanding just about the local context is also an issue. And I think it's important to separate the people working for an institution and the institution, but I'm not at all, I don't see I see more damaging work being done by ICE than what they are contributing. So how that might change and, what we're looking at in terms of separation of kids at the border from their families, like there are some very real issues. And I think the education goes a long way, but I think it's also about the priorities of federal institutions and what they're being instructed to do or not do. So, yeah. So I don't know if we should end there. That's kind of it's a big piece, but we are seeing a lot of different conversations happening now, and I think that's hopeful. But I think it's important for those of us who have, concerns about this community and, communities like them. I think it is important that we keep an eye on, these conversations and how they might change some policies and some treatment about people, because we are definitely in a different moment, but with a lot of the same people around. So that's key. But thank you so
much, Teresa. This has been just great. And thank you to all the people who asked the great questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. Definitely feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. If you have any questions about some of the links or the projects that I talked about, I'm happy to share. But thanks for joining me over a cold afternoon. And I hope you get to enjoy some snow because it's about time that we had a little bit. So.
Teresa, could you pop that up again? It was so fast.
Yeah, sure. I think if you hit the chat,
okay.
Yeah, you'll see it again, but it's just tmares, TMARES @uvm.edu.
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Have a nice afternoon.